My father's last words to me before I was disowned were, "A daughter who refuses to become a doctor has no place in this family." 7 years later, he said my name into a microphone at my brother's wedding, and every doctor in that ballroom turned to look at me. I was standing near the back doors in a black dress, holding a champagne glass I hadn't touched, watching the family that had erased me suddenly realize I was no longer the woman they had thrown away. My brother's bride was smiling for the photographers when my father saw me. His face changed first, then my mother's, and then my brother stopped smiling altogether. I had imagined this moment for 7 years, but never like this. Because I hadn't come to ruin their wedding. I had come because the groom had invited me himself. And he still had no idea why my family had spent 7 years pretending I didn't exist. My name is Claire Bennett. I was 40 years old, and for most of my childhood, the Bennett name meant one thing in our house: medicine. My grandfather had been a surgeon. My mother was a cardiologist. My father ran a private orthopedic practice that had grown into 3 clinics across the state. My older brother, Daniel, was the golden child who seemed to breathe medical terminology before he could spell his own name. There were framed degrees covering the hallway walls of our house, arranged in chronological order like medals on a military uniform. Every Sunday dinner was an unofficial performance review. My parents asked Daniel about his grades, his research, his residency applications, his future. When they turned to me, the questions were different. Have you reconsidered medical school? Have you taken another look at your entrance scores? Are you still wasting time at that community center? They never asked whether I was happy. I had always been the strange one in the family. I wasn't bad at school. I simply wasn't interested in becoming what everyone else had already decided I should be. While Daniel spent his teenage years memorizing anatomy diagrams, I volunteered at a rehabilitation center after school. I loved working with elderly patients, stroke survivors, and people recovering from injuries. I liked listening to them. I liked helping them stand when they were convinced they couldn't. My father called it assistant work. My mother called it a phase. But I called it a life. The summer I turned 28, I accepted a full-time position managing patient support services at the same rehabilitation center. I remember bringing the contract home, proud for the first time in years. My father read it without sitting down. "You're making a career out of being beneath us," he said. I laughed because I thought he was joking. He wasn't. 2 years later, Daniel announced that he had been accepted into one of the most prestigious surgical residency programs in the country. My parents rented a private dining room at a downtown restaurant to celebrate. 42 relatives and family friends came. My father stood with a champagne glass and introduced Daniel as the 4th generation of Bennett physicians. Everyone applauded. Then my mother looked directly at me and added, "Some children understand the responsibility of a family name. Others spend their lives trying to escape it." Nobody said my name, but everyone knew who she meant. I sat there quietly, feeling the old familiar heat rise behind my eyes. Then Daniel leaned toward me and whispered, "You could still fix this, Claire." I asked him what he meant. He smiled. "Apply to medical school. Dad would forgive you." That was the moment something inside me finally broke. Not because they wanted me to become a doctor. Because they believed my entire life was something that needed to be fixed. I went home that night, opened my laptop, and accepted a job offer from a small healthcare company that had been trying to recruit me for months. 3 days later, my father found out. He called me into his office. My mother was already sitting there. On his desk was my resignation letter from the rehabilitation center. Beside it was a folder containing every financial record they had ever helped me with. "We are done investing in someone who refuses to invest in herself," my father said. I stared at him. "I have never asked you to invest in me." My mother folded her hands. "Then perhaps you should stop expecting to remain part of this family." I thought that was a threat. It wasn't. It was a decision. My father slid one final envelope across the desk. Inside was a letter stating that I was no longer welcome at family events, no longer included in family business matters, and no longer considered part of the Bennett household. At the bottom was his signature. I looked at my mother. She wouldn't meet my eyes. Daniel stood in the doorway. I waited for him to say something, anything. He didn't. I picked up my coat, placed the envelope inside my purse and walked out. My father never came after me. 7 years passed. I built a career without them. I eventually became the regional director of a healthcare organization that specialized in rehabilitation and home recovery. I bought a small house outside the city. I built a quiet life. I stopped checking whether my parents had called. I stopped wondering whether Daniel had changed. I learned that silence can become peaceful when you stop waiting for someone else to break it. Then, 3 weeks before Daniel's wedding, an ivory invitation arrived at my house. I almost threw it away. Then I saw the handwritten name on the envelope, Daniel Bennett. And beneath it, in smaller letters, was a sentence that made my hands go cold. We hope you'll be there. 7 years after my family disowned me, they were inviting me back into the room where they had decided I didn't belong. I had no idea that accepting that invitation would change everything my family had spent generations building. The invitation stayed on my kitchen counter for 6 days. I moved it twice, opened it once, and then put it back exactly where it had been, as if the envelope itself might answer the question I was afraid to ask. Why would Daniel invite me? After 7 years of silence, there had to be a reason. People like my father didn't suddenly develop nostalgia. They calculated. They measured outcomes. They protected reputations. And my family had always been very good at pretending their calculations were love. On the 7th morning, I finally called the number printed on the invitation. Daniel answered. For 3 seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he said, "Claire." Just my name. No apology. No explanation. I asked him why he had invited me. He took a breath. "Because you're my sister." I almost laughed. 7 years ago, he had watched me walk out of our father's house without saying a word. Now he wanted to use the word sister as if it had been waiting patiently for him all this time. I asked whether Mom and Dad knew. He said, "Yes." Then his voice became quieter. "They don't want you there." That answer should have ended the conversation. Instead, I asked the question that had been sitting inside me for 7 years. "Then why did you send the invitation?" Daniel didn't answer. He simply said, "Please come, Claire. I need you there." The call ended before I could ask what he meant. For the next 3 weeks, I prepared without telling anyone. I bought a simple dark blue dress. Nothing expensive, nothing dramatic. I didn't want to look like I was trying to prove something. I didn't need to. I had already spent 7 years proving it to myself. The morning of the wedding, I stood in front of my bedroom mirror and looked at the woman staring back at me. 40 years old. Fine lines around my eyes. A few silver strands in my hair. A face that no longer belonged to the 28-year-old woman who had carried a signed letter out of her father's office. I touched the small scar near my wrist, a reminder from years earlier when I'd worked a double shift helping transfer a stroke patient. My mother would have called it evidence that I had chosen the wrong life. I smiled at my reflection. "No," I whispered. "I chose mine." The wedding was held at a private medical foundation's estate outside the city, the kind of place where the driveway was lined with black cars and the guests wore watches that cost more than my first house. The moment I stepped through the entrance, I recognized the atmosphere. Physicians everywhere. Hospital executives. Researchers. Surgeons. People who knew my father's name. People who had spent years calling him brilliant, visionary, respected. I saw my mother across the ballroom before she saw me. She was wearing silver and speaking to a group of cardiologists. Then her eyes landed on mine. Her smile disappeared for exactly 1 second. She leaned toward the woman beside her and whispered something. The woman looked at me. Then another person looked. Within 30 seconds, I could feel the room beginning to notice me. My father was standing near the stage. He followed their gaze. His expression became unreadable. I hadn't expected the reaction to hurt. Did. Not because I wanted their approval, but because some part of me had apparently been waiting 7 years to see whether they would recognize me. My father didn't walk toward me. My mother didn't either. Instead, Daniel appeared from behind the guests wearing his wedding suit. He looked older than the last time I'd seen him, but there was something different in his eyes. He hugged me before I could decide whether I wanted him to. "You came," he whispered. "You asked me to." He pulled away and looked at me carefully. I know. I wanted to ask him what was going on, but before I could, his bride called him from across the room. He squeezed my hand. "Stay close to me." Then he walked away. That sentence stayed with me. Stay close to me. Why? I spent the next hour watching my family perform happiness. My mother laughed at the right moments. My father shook hands with hospital directors. Daniel moved between tables like a man trying to keep several worlds from colliding. Then I noticed something strange. Every time someone asked Daniel about his new research project, my father answered for him. Every time someone mentioned the Foundation's upcoming expansion, my mother changed the subject. And every time the bride's father approached, my family became unusually careful. Then a tall woman in her 60s approached my table. I recognized her immediately. Dr. Margaret Reynolds. She was the chair of the foundation hosting the wedding and one of the most respected physicians in the region. She smiled warmly and held out her hand. "You must be Claire Bennett." Froze. "How do you know my name?" She looked genuinely surprised. "Daniel talks about you all the time." I looked across the ballroom. Daniel was watching us. Margaret leaned closer and lowered her voice. "I was actually hoping to meet you tonight." My stomach tightened. "Why?" Before she could answer, my father appeared beside us. His voice was calm, but his eyes were warning me. "Claire," he said, "we need to talk." 7 years of silence had ended with one invitation. Now, standing in that ballroom, I realized the wedding wasn't the reason they had brought me back. It was. My father guided me toward a quiet corridor behind the ballroom, one hand hovering near my elbow without actually touching me. It was the same gesture he had used when I was a child, and he wanted to move me out of a room without making a scene. 7 years disappeared in that hallway. For one ridiculous second, I was 28 again, standing in his office while he explained that family names had value and I was refusing to protect ours. He opened a small side door and waited for me to enter. I stayed where I was. "If this is about asking me to leave," I said, "you should have saved yourself the walk." His jaw tightened. "You always were stubborn." Smiled. "You always called it stubborn when you couldn't control me." My father looked toward the ballroom before lowering his voice. "There are people here tonight who don't know the history between us. That's because you made sure nobody knew I existed." He looked down for a moment. Then he said something I never expected. "Daniel wasn't supposed to invite you." I stared at him. "Then why did he?" My father didn't answer. He simply said, "You need to understand that tonight is important for this family." There it was. Not important for Daniel. Not important for the bride. Family. I folded my arms. "And what do you want from me?" His expression hardened. "Nothing. I want you to behave." I almost laughed. 7 years ago you disowned me. Tonight you want me to behave. He stepped closer. "Claire, you have no idea what's at stake." "Then tell me." He hesitated. "Not here." When I returned to the ballroom, I found Daniel waiting near the stage. He looked nervous. Not wedding nervous. Terrified nervous. "What did Dad say?" he asked. I told him the truth. "He said I should behave." Daniel closed his eyes for a second. "Of course he did." Then he looked at me and whispered, "I need you to trust me." I wanted to ask why, but the band began playing and guests started taking their seats. Daniel squeezed my shoulder before walking toward the altar. I sat at a table near the back, far enough from my parents that I could breathe. During the ceremony, I tried to focus on the bride, but I kept noticing Margaret Reynolds watching my father. There was tension between them. After the vows, everyone moved toward the reception hall. I was halfway through a glass of water when Margaret approached again. Claire, may I ask you something? He nodded. She studied my face. Were you involved with the Bennett Family Foundation? No, her eyebrows lifted. Not even before you left. I was never allowed near it. She looked genuinely confused. That's strange. Why? She lowered her voice. Because 7 years ago, your father told our board that you left voluntarily to pursue another career. I felt something inside me go cold. He told you I left? Yes. He paused. He said you were happy to start over. I stared at her. 7 years of silence had suddenly taken on a different shape. My family hadn't simply erased me. They had rewritten me. Before I could respond, Daniel appeared beside us. Margaret looked at him. Your sister deserves to know. Daniel swallowed. I know. He turned toward me. Claire, there's something I should have told you years ago. Waited. After you left, Dad changed the foundation's succession plan. My heart began beating faster. What does that have to do with me? Daniel glanced toward our parents. Everything. He told me that our grandfather had created a private clause in the family foundation years before his death. It wasn't about medical degrees. It wasn't about academic achievement. It was about leadership. Whoever demonstrated the ability to build something that improved patient care could eventually claim controlling authority over the foundation. My grandfather had apparently believed that medicine was bigger than a title. My father had spent years telling everyone that Daniel was his chosen successor. But there was one problem. The foundation's independent board had never accepted that arrangement. They had been waiting for evidence. Daniel looked at me. They've been watching what you've built. I shook my head. Bright Path. He nodded. The home care organization. I stared at him. How would they know about that? Margaret answered. Because I recommended your organization for a statewide rehabilitation contract 4 years ago. My mouth went dry. You knew. She smiled. We all knew. Your father knew too. That was the moment the entire evening changed. My father hadn't invited me because he missed me. He hadn't suddenly decided I was family again. He was afraid. Afraid that the person he had thrown away had built something more valuable than everything he had spent his life protecting. Daniel took my hand. I'm sorry, he whispered. I should have stood up for you. I looked at him for a long moment. Why now? His eyes filled with something close to shame. Because tomorrow morning, the foundation board votes on the new chair. I understood immediately. And Dad wants you to get it. Daniel shook his head. No, he looked toward the stage where our father was preparing to give the first toast. They want you. I couldn't breathe for a second. What? Daniel's voice cracked. Grandfather's clause. They found your records, your work, your contracts, your patient outcomes. They believe you are the only person who actually meets his requirements. I looked across the room at my father. He was smiling, surrounded by doctors who had spent decades respecting him. He raised his glass. Then his eyes met mine. There was no anger there anymore. There was fear. The microphone was handed to him. He stepped onto the stage. The room went silent. My father looked directly at me and said, There is someone here tonight who was never supposed to return to this family. 200 people turned toward me. Then he said my name. And what he said next was something I had spent 7 years believing I would never hear from him. My father stood beneath the ballroom lights, one hand resting against the microphone, while 200 guests watched me from their tables. I could hear the soft clink of silverware, the quiet hum of the air conditioning, even the faint music coming from the speakers behind the stage. My father looked at me for several seconds before speaking. Claire Bennett, he said. 7 years ago, I made the worst decision of my life. Nobody moved. My mother lowered her glass. Daniel stared at the floor. My father continued. I believed our family name was something you had to protect by becoming exactly what generations before us had become. I was wrong. A murmur moved through the ballroom. I felt my chest tighten. I had imagined my father apologizing 1,000 times during those 7 silent years, But in every version I imagined, I was angry. Now that it was happening, I didn't know what to feel. He turned toward the board members seated near the front. My daughter was never the failure I called her. She was the one person in this family who understood what medicine was supposed to be about. My mother stood abruptly. Christopher, this is not the place. He looked at her. No, this is exactly the place. The room became completely silent. Then my father revealed what had been hidden from me for years. Our grandfather had left a sealed letter with the foundation's attorneys before he died. The letter contained a final condition for the family's medical foundation. The next permanent chair could not simply inherit the position through bloodline or medical credentials. That person had to demonstrate that they had improved patient care, built an organization that served people outside the family's private network, and created measurable change without using the Bennett name to open doors. My father had spent 7 years trying to convince the board that Daniel was the natural successor. But Daniel's accomplishments, impressive as they were, had all been built inside the system our family had created. Mine had been built completely outside it. My father looked at me. Claire built her organization without our money, our connections, or our name. He paused. And she built something bigger than I ever understood. I could hear my mother breathing behind him. The woman who had once told me I was beneath our family was now standing in front of hundreds of people, while my father described me as the person most qualified to lead everything they had spent decades protecting. I walked toward the stage slowly. Nobody stopped me. My father stepped away from the microphone. For the first time in 7 years, he stood in front of me without a command ready. I owe you an apology, he said quietly. More than one. I looked at him. Yes, you do. His eyes filled with tears. I thought if you didn't become a doctor, you were throwing away the family. I never understood that you were building something of your own. I wanted to forgive him immediately because part of me had spent 7 years waiting for those words. But forgiveness wasn't something I could hand him simply because he had finally learned how to ask. Dad, I said, you didn't lose me because I refused to become a doctor. You lost me because you made love conditional. He nodded slowly. I know. My mother finally approached. She looked smaller than I remembered. Claire, she whispered, I was trying to make you strong. I shook my head. You were trying to make me acceptable. She started crying. I didn't. I had already cried enough years ago. Daniel stepped onto the stage beside us. He took the microphone and looked at the guests. There's one more thing everyone needs to know. He turned toward his sister. Claire didn't just build a successful organization. She saved mine. The room went quiet again. He explained that 2 years earlier, when his surgical program was struggling to create a post-discharge recovery network, he had unknowingly used a system developed by Claire's organization. The program had reduced readmission rates dramatically. He had written a recommendation for the system without realizing it belonged to his own sister. When he finally discovered the truth, he understood that the woman our family had called a disappointment had quietly become one of the most respected people in the field. I invited her tonight because I was tired of pretending our family was perfect, Daniel said. And because I wanted my sister back. I looked at him and felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. Not revenge. Not victory. Relief. The foundation board voted the next morning. I accepted the chair only after making one condition. The Bennett name would no longer determine who deserved opportunity. Scholarships would be awarded based on service, not family connections. Nursing assistants, caregivers, rehabilitation workers, and community health workers would receive the same respect our family had always reserved for physicians. My father's old wall of degrees eventually came down. Not because I demanded it. He removed it himself. In its place, we built something different. There were photographs of patients returning home, caregivers helping elderly people walk again, rehabilitation teams working through the night, and one photograph of my grandfather sitting beside a nurse whose name our family had forgotten. My father placed it in the center. A year later, my mother asked if she could come to my office. Said yes. She walked in carrying a small wooden box. Inside was the old family photograph from my graduation dinner, the one where I had been deliberately left out. She had found the original negative and had it restored. "I want you to have this," she said. I looked at the picture. Everyone was there except me. Closed the box. "I don't need the picture," I told her. "But you can stay for coffee." She started crying before I could finish the sentence. That was the first time I understood something I hadn't understood at 28. Winning isn't always watching the people who hurt you lose. Sometimes winning is reaching the day when their opinion no longer decides how you see yourself. 7 years earlier, my father had told me I had no place in the Bennett family. 7 years later, he stood in front of that same family and admitted that I had built something they never could have built without me. I didn't become a doctor. I became something my family had never taught me how to measure. Became my own person. And if your family has ever made you feel like you weren't enough because your life didn't match their expectations, remember this. You don't have to become the person they planned for you to become to prove that you are worthy. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't destroying the people who rejected you. It's building a life so meaningful that their rejection becomes irrelevant. If you were Claire, would you have forgiven your father after 7 years? Or would you have walked away for good? Tell me in the comments. And if this story touched something personal in you, subscribe for more stories about betrayal, family, resilience, and the people who finally discover their worth.